Memory Transcription Subject, Chief Hunter ISIF, Arxer Rebellion Command. Date, Standardized Human Time, March 10, 2137. 20,000 foes remained active in the system. I wasn't sure how the Terrans planned to gain the Duertan Shield's compliance with their plans. If the local remnants, figuring at about half of the invading forces tally, surged toward the Kolshians, it would make our support much more effective. Their motivation for aggressive action was obvious, with Kalqua rocked by antimatter bombs. Planetary defenses were long since gone, and our rescue operation was the only reason their last remaining forces hadn't been cut down by overwhelming opposition. The Yodel's particle beams gave us a chance, especially since they lacked the recharging requirements of plasma weaponry. Enemy drones had invested their focus on the technocracy's pesky vessels, giving the Duertan some breathing room. Most of humanity's drone aid had perished in the initial engagement, protecting life and limb over unbreathing, unfeeling metal. I was pleased that the Duertan hadn't turned their guns on us or the UN, but I suppose even they weren't foolish enough to invite extinction. It was easy to claim that it was better not to exist than to bow to a predator's whims, when that ultimatum wasn't staring an herbivore in the face. Self-preservation was an instinct that transcended all classes of lifeforms. With the Malti, Dresden, and other Federation subsidiaries driven out by us, there was hope of keeping some of Kalqua's infrastructure intact. I winced, thinking what percentage of the populace lived in the cities that had already been hit. Per my documents, the last census data suggests a population of about 6.5 billion, including foreigners on work visas or diplomatic stays. It's a smaller number than the amount of people on Earth, largely due to the constant casualties brought on by this endless war. It was important to take inventory of exactly what was transpiring around my command ship. Through the near-microscopic dots Kaisal had highlighted, I could glimpse human nanodrones on the fly. The Duertan Shield seemed to lack a strategy with their remaining ships, with every unit operating out of independent desperation. The Yodel were being hounded by any drone that could burn toward them, and could only fend off so many guns-blazing foes, even with exemplary flying. It was obvious where our plasma support was best spent. If humanity's manned ships had taken on automatons in prior engagements, there was no reason Arxer crews couldn't hold our own too. It would reflect poorly on my abilities as a commander if we couldn't drive the Kolshians out in one fell swoop. Focus plasma on targets who are in pursuit of the Yodel. Save our missiles for any Kolshians who come for us, I ordered. Kaisal narrowed his eyes. Understood, sir. I've forwarded a handful of possible targets that are almost in range of our weapons. Lisa looked up from her spot beside Bondarenko. Sir, if I may, I've been informed that the Duertan have been persuaded to charge the enemy. All our ducks are in a row. It happens right now, all at once. We'll be throwing everything but the kitchen sink at them. Oleksiy declared, with a chipper grin. Everything but the kitchen sink? The idiom didn't compute with me, and I figured I could attempt to utilize human levity to build rapport with my crew. If I was going to bring Arxer back to our old ways, and I couldn't learn from Vizith, it would behoove me to replicate the Terran's bedside manner. That saying does not make sense. Why would we be throwing a faucet tool in a space battle? Is this a remark on using anything as a weapon? Well, not that we wouldn't, you know, there were secret programs to use cats as acoustic listening devices. This saying was popularized during our Second World War, or so I hear. Anything usable went to the war efforts, so I guess it took off then. I regret ever asking to learn more about your inane rationale. Let me know if the United Nations has anything useful to impart, rather than using confusing excerpts about household appliances. Yes sir. It is about to get serious, for sure. You could say we're about to go out of the frying pan, into the fire. You think it's funny to use this idiom after I warned you, yes? You're lucky your government would not tolerate me breaking your ankles like I did Kaisel's. The Arxer grunt winced, drawing his tail closer. Do not remind me, sir. Given that humans must char their food, and their culture, like ours, revolves around meat eating, it computes that kitchenware is a priceless contributor to their daily lives. I can see why the Duerden would be relegated to the kitchen sink. As incompetent herbivores without a shred of common sense, I do not expect their charge to be useful or deliver on its promised effects. A bunch of inadequate resources together may be enough, is that not correct? The Terrans must have completed a similar assessment in their stratagems. We are to save the herbivores and do our part, lest we look to be bumbling idiots like the Duerden. Understood. I'm on it. Our weapons station was attempting to lock onto a Kolshan drone, utilizing the data that Kaisal had forwarded. Several captains in the rebel fleet were coordinating their fire, cultivating synchronicity to deal massive damage once we drew within range. The Yodel were clever enough to keep just ahead of the enemy pursuers, and to slowly loop toward us on an indirect path. They were routing the Federation fleet toward us, which would make it easier to get a crack at our targets. Power was diverted away from non-essential systems aboard my command vessel, ensuring that our initial volley was sizzling with intensity. The dazzling flashes of thousands of plasma beams, fired off in unison, was an impressive display of control. The robots could dodge through some of the plasma, calculating the munition's intended course and abruptly twirling out of the way. However, that meant they had to ease up on their pursuit of the technocracy vessels. The Yodel were ready to bombard them with particle beams, as quickly as their weaponry would allow. The Duerden had also diverted most of their remaining ships into a formation advance, and were using everything but the kitchen sink, that is, they were using whatever weapons they had left over from the prolonged engagement. Kaisal had ordered our weapons station to hold their fire, and only now granted the permission to annihilate a target. With the Kolshans being pressed on all sides, our chosen target was paying no mind to any rebel fleet follow-up. I see the point of bringing the Duerden shield forward. On their own, they pack very little claw strength, but with the drones ignoring them in favor of greater threats, they can choose their marks unimpeded. The slim number of remaining Terran drones had drifted away from the Yodel side, as we stepped into the fold. Humanity's computer-piloted fleet mobilized beside the Duerden shield, protecting their remnants in the scarce cases they were fired upon. My best guess was that the UN didn't want the Duerden to start sustaining heavy losses, and crumble with their already frazzled nerves. The brazen charge wouldn't hold if they started dropping like prey. I waited with impatience for our plasma railguns to recharge, wanting to pin down the Kolshans before they could craft an evasion strategy. The Terran nanodrones I'd spotted on the sensors earlier zipped toward any Kolshan drones who had resumed their pursuit of the Yodel. I could see that a few dozen technocracy ships had been on the receiving end of missile barrages, from debris scattered in the void. The microscopic human automatons pounced on the enemy's lack of shielding, and I watched one swarm ram itself into a foe's thrusters. While it wasn't as decisive as a reactor strike, it was enough to immobilize the drone. A Duerden shield vessel moseyed in to mop it up, as even those foolish avians could take down a paralyzed target. Kaisal, how many more drones do you expect we need to kill before their algorithms recognize they've lost? I asked. Lisa shifted on her feet. If I may interject, I think it's not so simple. The Shadow Fleet has the kind of numbers that losses aren't their concern. Should the algorithms assess that the battle is lost, I imagine they'll shift their focus to taking out as many souls on Kalqua as possible before going down. This has always been about teaching the Duerden a lesson. Their aim was to engineer the complete eradication of the species that defied them, so I cannot argue against your conclusion. My question to the runt, to Kaisal, stands. What's the number where it's decided that all is lost? The scrawny Arxer lashed his tail. In my estimation, we have already crossed that threshold, sir. Between the Yodel, us, and the Duerden shield scoring kills, I count 6,500 fallen enemies. If there's anything the Calamari wanted to try, they have to make that push while they still have numbers. I squinted at the viewport, assessing where a push might come from. Several Shadow Fleet drones had ramped up the pressure on technocracy vessels, despite understanding it left them vulnerable to the 3 species covering the Yodel. Another contingent was feinting toward the Duertan homeworld, knowing full well that the Terrans would ram automatons into their foes if needed, to stop them from drawing close enough. The final break-off group I spotted was waltzing into our crosshairs, right into the waiting missiles that we'd conserved to avoid such a head-on assault. Between all of those ostensible last-ditch efforts, there was a small number of hostiles that were unaccounted for. With the Duertan closing in on the Kolshians from the planet's direction, the Terrans functioning as a middleman, and us backing up the Yodel on headings from the system's outer bounds, that left a single avenue of possibility. The only path to slip away was to blaze off horizontally, while locking the other engagements into a limited area. It was difficult to detect which direction they would have chosen, with the craft having escaped visual range, debris, coarse data, and a slew of active weapons were drowning out sensor leads in a sea of information. Rather than allowing the Kolshians to dilute our senses, we needed to filter out the irrelevant matters. I hurried over to the sensor station to preside over the full array, and moved Kaisal out of the way without explanation. Despite grasping that it would leave us blind to a target lock, I switched off all data correlating to in-flight weapons. My next subset to subtract was anything less than half of a ship length, even though that would entail manual spotting to avoid flying into debris or friendly nano-drones. It still remained difficult to parse a particular group of renegades from their buddies, so I resorted to removing all vessels which had been marked as friendly. It was less than ideal to not know our partners' vectors, on top of not viewing their weapons' trajectories. However, if my theory was correct, we had little time to mitigate the Shadow Fleet's plan to double the casualties on Kalqua. I pointed with a claw to faint energy readings. Peel back. See these readings here? The Shadow Fleet snuck some ships off that way, to bomb Kalqua. Send our fastest craft after them. I'll send word to the United Nations, Lisa chimed in. They'll be responsible for filling in the Duertan shield, who I'm sure have been so pleasant to work with. Oleksiy narrowed his eyes. I'll tell the Yodel, though I don't imagine they have a hope of intercepting ships that are closer to us. We have to stop the squids. Each drone probably only has one antimatter bomb aboard, but if there's a few hundred ships that's... We do learn arithmetic on RIS, contrary to common beliefs. That would induce more city hits than they've already racked up in the sum of the battle. Over 1 billion more dead. Unlike Kalsum's fools, the Kolshians have been strategic enough to take out key military strongholds and seats of government across Kalqua already, so now, it'll be pure population. The Duertan will have a fraction of their former power. As is, they may lose the deciding stake in their shield alliance, Lisa postulated. That might be for the best, except that they're a driving force in hating the Federation. Plus, their manufacturing capacity is second to none in their little group. We cannot afford to lose virtually all of their major urban centers, yes? The fastest ships in the rebel fleet have already received a communique to pursue this vector, but we will trail behind to supervise. Divert all power to propulsion. Kaisal squinted. With respect, sir, we cannot hope to catch them in a ship of our size. I do not know that our speediest vessels can catch them. I did not specify thrusters. Lisa, your job is to get us in touch with the Duertan shield, through the UN, charge our warp drive through the standard, stationary protocol, and coordinate a fraction of a second for us to warp to their intended destination. My hope is that we are in and out before the Kolshians notice the opportunity. Get a small enough number of our other warships to jump at the same time, but not enough that the drones notice we're prepping for warp and become wise to it. Peacekeeper Reynolds ducked her head. I'm on it, sir. I'll coordinate with navigations. Pardon my audacity for asking questions, domineering Chief Hunter, but if we're catching up through FTL, why are you sending the speediest ships after them at sublight velocities? The Arxer runt spoke up. It's a mere diversion, Kaisal, so that they think we're going after them in that hopeless fashion. I paced back to the captain's station, allowing him to resume full control over the sensor's hub. What do the prey accuse us of so often? It's a ruse. The gravity disturbances of the FTL disruptors were preventing warp travel now. If the Kolshians realized that they'd have an opportunity to slip into subspace, that would allow them to poke their units directly through to orbital range. It was quintessential that they wouldn't have the slightest clue of our intentions, and that the field was reasserted as soon as it was opened. This might mean we'd be thrown back into real space the hard way, but despite the unpleasant variables, this was the only hope of catching the Calquibound bomb-toters. It was a necessary gambit for the continuance of the Duerten as a galactic power. This entire rescue mission was a pointless waste of resources if this doesn't succeed, beyond the senseless loss of life that would mirror an Arxer raid. I hope to never see a planet come to that again, so this must work. As we stalled in position, protected at the far reaches of the rebel fleet, I watched the warp drive uncoil suitably to chart a path. If I had time to process what was unfolding, I might have even been nervous, despite my immense battle experience. However, it was over before I realized it had started. My command ship lurched into subspace, before our violent expulsion as the disruptors went back up near instantaneously. In that sliver of time which was imperceptible to any life form, we'd punched our ticket ahead of the Shadow Fleet's path. Our warship could stand in the path of the incoming, bomb-bearing foes. The havoc the FTL disruptors wreaked on our biology wasn't something that could be trained away. The sudden transition confounded the senses, the skin wrapped around my brain felt too tight, my ears bore the sensation of being turned inside out as deafening bells rang within, my body temperature was climbing like I was under a sun lamp, and my eyes were projecting psychedelic patterns onto everything I saw. An unspeakable level of vertigo made it difficult to think, let alone direct my equally dazed soldiers to battle stations. The humans had turned flushed shades of red, and were on the floor struggling to coordinate movements. A growl rumbled in my throat, as I leaned against my station with the full force of my weight. Divert power, back to weapons, I huffed. Move. A weapons technician slumped against the buttons, managing to move a paw that weighed a ton to the needed buttons. He collapsed with exhaustion after completing the sequence, and I swiveled my slowly normalizing vision back to Kaisal. The Arxer runt was on his knees, judging by the concerned look in his eyes, he couldn't read the overlay. I tried to consult my own, but the dots all bled together through the blur. My eyelids squeezed shut in merciful darkness for a few seconds, and I sucked in measured breaths. My gaze snapped back open with renewed focus, allowing me to gauge the situation. The Kolshian drones were mere seconds from arriving, so I hoped that my crew could shake off the FTL disruptors' effects in the next few moments. To my surprise, there were a small handful of Terran drones and Duerten shield vessels that had made the jump with us, forsaking their counterparts for the good of Calqua. At least the friendly automatons couldn't be shaken by the transitional effects on biologics. The rebels on my bridge got their tails back into motion, and tended to the now-ready plasma railgun. We had to throw everything we had at the Shadow Fleet. I straightened with pride, despite how much that segue had taken out of me. Arxer are the finest warriors in the galaxy. We stop them here. We stop the Federation here. Confident growls echoed across the bridge, as my followers tapped into their strength reserves. The Duerten shield still looked a bit listless, so their fire might be a bit behind our initial volley. Kaisal zoomed in on a Kolshian drone, and with startling efficiency, our plasma weapon fired. Two other rebel friendlies targeted the same vessel from different angles, making evasion improbable. The automaton fired off a desperate stream of missiles before it was blasted into oblivion. Terran robots deployed a stream of interceptors to neutralize that parting gift. I didn't wait for the light of the reactor explosion to die down, before ordering weapons to unleash the missiles that we'd been preserving to save our own hides. The meandering Duerten shield caught on enough to dump every missile they had at the oncoming enemies, since that was an easy task to complete. Terran drones forged ahead of us, cruising along vectors that put them on collision courses. Despite the contentious resistance, the Federation were getting close to orbital range of Calqua. The fractional contingent of craft we warped here had to put a swift end to the few hundred Shadow Fleet bogies. I never thought I'd be fighting side by side with leaf-licking apes and the Duertan shield, I muttered to myself, before bellowing orders at a pitch where my crew could hear. However fast is the quickest you can get that plasma gun online, I want it done faster. Throw everything but the kitchen sink at them. If we have it in stock, use it. Zhao will definitely have to afford us some maintenance and restocking after this escapade. Our resources are limited, and now depleted. Our interceptors were repurposed to be hurled at the drones, hoping that anything that landed would hinder their approach. The Duertan shield had finally brought their plasma guns alive, and were spitting off beams in defense of Calqua. The Shadow Fleet dispensed shield-breaking missiles of their own across our joint line, before returning another round of plasma, tailored toward the Duertan ships. I saw that, with the small number of ships we had in their way, our enemy intended to push through our weakest link. 3 craft might fall, but one making it through would lend consolation to them. There had been a negligible number of Terran drones to protect the Duertan from their folly, and the Arxer rebel fleet was otherwise occupied with targets of our own. After running the mental math in my head, it was clear to me that we couldn't stop every planet-bound vessel alone, we had to handle what was in front of us. Due to the efforts I'd led, my forces were cutting down 200-odd ships that would have ravaged the planet. It spared Calqua the majority of the damage, but despite our heroic victory approaching certainty, it wasn't possible here to save the homogeneity from a few final losses. The Duertan shield failed to hold their defensive line, and the Kolshan drones broke through the final stretch to orbital range above the inhabited world. The Duertan pivoted in desperation, with a few desperate enough to save their loved ones that they mimicked the actions of the Terran drones, ramming into the bombers. Though most hostiles became easy pickings, due to taking no actions to protect themselves, about 5 dozen enemies made it through to their destination. Plasma beams and missiles struck true against the genocidal metal hunks, but it was too late. The shield tossed kinetics at the antimatter payloads, hoping against hope to strike the fast-moving warheads, yet knowing it wouldn't work. In rote silence, my claws switched onto the comms channel, to hear the yodel declaring they were cleaning up the last remaining Kolshan hostiles back at the warp point. A dark part of my soul almost admired how the Shadow Fleet sacrificed thousands in a losing battle to increase their casualty count. Our intervention had saved the Duertan from total extinction, and it was an effort that would garner respect from the United Nations. It remained to be seen how this would affect relations between the homogeneity and the sapient coalition, but it might even open the birds' minds to cordial relations. However, as 60-plus antimatter bombs delved into Calqua's atmosphere, I couldn't feel any sense of triumph. Today was another bleak mark on the Federation's blood-stained history in this galaxy. Memory transcription subject, Governor Tarva of the Venlil Republic. Date, Standardized Human Time, March 16, 2137. The election required a colossal effort across Venlil territory to ensure that each voter's voice was heard. The digitization of the election campaigns meant that votes could be cast electronically, in the privacy of their homes, and well in advance of the opening of physical polls. Several identifiers, including biomarkers, were used to verify their identity. Early votes could be changed at any time up to the closing of the ballot collection. However, in the interests of not singling out anyone with connectivity problems or who couldn't access an electronic device, in-person voting facilities were open on the big week. Many citizens preferred being part of the herd, and exercising their civic rights among a crowd. The results from the large percentage of online voters would be accessible almost instantly, but physical votes from each city, outpost, or colony had to be forwarded by local governments. I hadn't felt this nervous during my first election, yet the uncertainty of who would emerge victorious today gnawed at me. Polls were indecisive, with turnout from certain demographics likely to play a major part in who was victorious. A major setback was that most human citizens had been barred from participating in the election, which could have pushed me over the edge. The soul of Scalga was at stake, in my opinion, and I wasn't sure how much of our progress Veln could reverse if he took office. His isolationism would bring us further away from humanity at the worst possible time. I've done everything I can with social media outreach and campaign ads. I've visited every major city, and run myself ragged going to rural villages and colonies where my popularity is subpar. Any voters I could sway in Veln's strongholds would increase my chances. With the polls due to close in only a few minutes, I found myself watching a compilation of attack ads that Veln had spent significant money circulating on the airwaves and the internet. It wasn't as if I was innocuous on this front. I'd gone after his meteoric rise as the nominated challenger, claiming he gained the most signatures by inflating his accomplishments within a small colony's government. Veln isn't ready to handle the responsibility of all Venlolkind, my tagline had proclaimed. I did see my opponent as clever, but someone who lacked a moral backbone or a good vision for our future. My rival was clever enough to claim his platform worked on any scale he'd tackled so far, and slammed my policies by clipping out-of-context quotes. Tarva has proven that she cannot handle the responsibility for Venlolkind. Her unilateral decisions have given you no say in your future, the ad narrator declared, as images of predator disease patients being led out of facilities by humans played on screen. She takes her ideas straight from the new predators. This was her claim about humans' knowledge of predator disease. A clip of me from the debate played on screen. They have a better idea than we do of what's actually predator behavior. Do you want a puppet leader that trusts humanity's judgment over our own? Do you think predators have better ideas than us? The footage showed my rival touring an exterminators guild on his colony, and signing documents. Veln is not a follower. He's a leader who will listen to what the people want. You know who to vote for. I leaned away from Noah on the couch, and held the remote out of his reach as he tried to cut the feed. Glim seemed apathetic from his position in a reclining chair. The rescue had been taken off my last campaign stops, despite how useful he would be to court the exterminator vote. In his current state, he would have done more harm than good to my message. It would look like the Terrans were coercing him into supporting me. The next ad in the compilation rolled, going after me on my ties to Earth again. While Tarva was running around, chasing the human ambassador, Veln was working for his constituents. Listen to her own words about how much of her policies and recent efforts have centered around Earth, a different narrator read. My eyes were narrowed with indignance on screen. We've been through many stressful situations together, from nearly getting shot down en route to Alpha, to our efforts to stop the genocide of Earth, to working hand in paw with the cattle rescues that my government and his bargained for the release of, and now to our collaboration for the summit. Not only did Tarva admit to negotiating with the Arxer, a true predator scourge that eats our children, and ate her own, she also listed all her accomplishments as things on humanity's agenda. There is no difference between our planets under her leadership. Behind the narrator's words, images played of me running with Meyer and Noah, as humans stampeded and smoke rose in the background. By her own admission on the debate stage, your goods will cost more because of higher value-added taxes to fund these adventures. And for all of that, the question remains, what has she done for you? Is your planet better now than it was 6 years ago? The clip ended with the words "Vote Veln." No more federations. Flashing atop a picture of my rival holding a baby Venlol. I couldn't deny that he was excellent at the political game, and it made me seethe. Noah didn't want me to wind myself up, pouncing toward me to grab my wrist. He pried the remote from my grasp, and switched it over to a live stream of a news channel. The human winked, before pointing to a clock on the mantel. I flicked my ear in acknowledgement, hearing activity through my campaign headquarters. My diplomatic advisor, Chelm, peeked his head. Right on time. The polls have closed. I prepared speeches for both outcomes, ma'am, and sent them to your holopad. Thank you. Whatever happens, it's been an honor working with you, I acknowledged. How are the exit polls looking? Depends on the jurisdiction. You're polling poorly in rural areas, colonies, or the places with the strongest exterminator guilds. Dayside City is leaning toward you, which is good. Noah bared his teeth. Think good thoughts, Tarva. You have a heart of gold, they'd be silly not to re-elect you. Maybe. We both know the amount of change I've brought has put me in a precarious position. The polls seem to have slid toward him since the debate. I thought I did well, but those sound bites about humans are hurting me. I'm glad you've stood up for us, even when it's not easy. What do you think, Glim? The rescue offered a blank stare. I think we're going to lose. Not because people all hate humans, but because people hate how Tarva is way too close to you. And they're right. You two literally bite each other's faces. Chelm pinned his ears back against his head. Wait, what? Glim's not well. You're dismissed, Chelm, I said hastily. The diplomatic advisor couldn't depart from the room soon enough, and he rejoined the larger crowd assembled around a massive screen in the lobby. I would be there when the results were expected to be known, but in this election, it could come down to the wire. Noah seemed aggravated at Glim, despite the fact that the sweet human rarely showed anger toward any Venlil. Even his patience had limits, though he forgot about the rescue's snide remarks as his eyes darted to our television set. The Terran beamed and pecked me on the cheek, as the 64% who voted early had tilted 50.8% in my favor, compared to Veln's 49.2%. However, I knew better than to celebrate this early, with it being this close and the rural villages being the ones that skewed toward in-person ballot casting. It would have been preferable if my margin here was wider, rather than depending on the last third of the votes to be favorable. I cozied up to the astronaut with unspeakable weariness, shooting a warning look at Glim and not to mouth off again. After the unfathomable stress of the past few months, I wasn't sure I was ready for this claw-biting, long night waiting for results to come in across our space. Dayside City, the capital and home of the most humans on Skalga, was among the first provinces to send results. 65% of the in-person voters called for my re-election, though I wasn't sure how much I should read into that. The ones who were Terran dissidents had long since moved out of the city, so if anything, it was discouraging that nearly a third had sided with Veln. Other major cities turned out even less promising results, with me narrowly holding the physical votes in almost all, except for Tonalus City skewing 53.4% toward my opponent. That still padded my lead, and Noah seemed ready to take a victory lap. I respected his optimism. I don't know why, but I've had a bad feeling about this election since the day began. Maybe it's just my nerves. Internally, I'm not confident I have the support of my people. Even if I do win, it's clear from these margins that the planet is divided. That was the last good news we'd had in the evening. Rural villages like Seljal Falls, home to Glim's aunt, poured in their tepid amounts of votes, but several skewed around the 75% mark in Veln's favor. While one small settlement wouldn't have been enough to make a dent in my lead of millions, together, they were eating into the metropolitan vote. These people had always been traditionalists, and were known to be less than cordial with human refugees. Lack of interaction with Terrans meant they never had the opportunity to change their minds. You can't win them all, Noah had said, trying to massage the tension from my shoulders. The issue was that I wasn't winning any, and that my campaign efforts in those areas didn't seem to have stopped the bleeding. It was a blowout in every single village, which I could imagine Veln feeling the swing of momentum. The colonies only lowered the gap further, and the numbers made my heart plummet. My opponent had been actively ferrying voters on his home colony, Milna, to the polls, and even been on one of those transports himself to plead his case in his already strongest territory. I thought it had been a foolish play, since he already had their votes as a popular governor, but rehashing his beloved tenure paid dividends. Milna was one of the last colonies to report their totals because they nearly doubled a record in-person turnout. Veln was seen as their candidate. Veln is a hometown hero who hasn't forgotten his roots. If you ask voters on Milna, Jonek had announced on the election coverage broadcast. Off of Venlo Prime soil, she's seen as the governor of humans. Perhaps it would have been wise to distance herself more from the UN. Not good. Colonies never feel attached to affairs of the homeworld, but even ones without Veln the Visitor are bringing turnout. They have a stake in the humans' arrival, and the ones who don't are no more inclined to vote than past elections. My numerical advantage had been millions away from my opponent, and seemed insurmountable to Noah, had shrunk to a sliver as the night progressed. The rural villages whittled down my advantage to half of its original count. The unexpected turnout at Milna was the start of a continuing skid. By the time all colonies had reported, my lead was at a mere 493 votes. I fielded calls from the UN Secretary-General wishing me luck and thanking me for everything I'd done for humanity, which I think was Zhao's way of saying they thought there was a good chance I might lose. The Earthlings must be scrambling to figure out how to deal with a possible Governor Veln, and they didn't want to spring goodbyes on me if I was unseated. Jonek perked his ears as the news broadcast returned from a break. Hello. If you're tuning in expecting us to hear who the new governor of Skalga is, we have one province outstanding, the science settlement of Eliga, which has been under sandstorm conditions and is just making contact now. I'm told we can expect results from them in a few minutes. What an election it's been. Polling in Eliga has been a toss-up, and it wasn't visited by Tarva or Veln. This could go either way. We should go outside with the others, Noah whispered. Governor or not, I'll always love you. I wrapped my prosthetic tail around his wrist. I love you too. If I had to do everything all over again, the only thing I'd change is sending that distress signal in the first place. We'll get through this. Of course we will. Worst that happens is you retire from public service, and we get to run off together like I've imagined for months. That's not so terrible, right? It is what I want, but humanity needs me in charge of Skalga, to preserve our close alliance. The Venlol can't go back completely, love. You gave us a chance, you made sure millions of people who never would have thought about dealing with predators did the same, and you saved our species to boot. You've done so much, we couldn't ask any more. Don't worry about humans, because you've done more than your part on our behalf. Emotion swelled in my throat, as I marched toward the doorway to enter the lobby with the rest of the staff. These could be my last moments as the leader of Skalga. Regardless of what Noah said, I felt responsible for the efficacy of my campaign strategies. How could I justify keeping our relationship quiet to maintain my office if I lost my position to a populist charmer like Veln? How could I have any say in decisions affecting millions of Terran refugees on this planet? I cared about what happened to the Earthlings. That was the sole reason I sought re-election at all, for their sake. Noah glanced over his shoulder toward Glim. Do you want to come with us, and watch the results with the group? We'd love for you to join us. No, the rescue mumbled. Why not? You were a part of this team as much as anyone else. I helped Tarva because I owed her my life, not because I think she's a fitting governor. A real Venlil wouldn't have argued for an Arxer to speak at the summit. I hope Veln wins. I flinched at that sudden admission from the cattle rescue. How could he oppose my candidacy, after my policies freed millions like him from abhorrent conditions? I had volunteered to help with the reintroduction program because I cared about these mistreated Venlil. A scowl took over my astronaut's features, and his fist clenched beneath my coiled tail. Noah didn't speak another word to Glim, instead hurrying out with me to the lobby. I tried to clear that exchange from my mind, but the sinking feeling that plagued me all day had reached its crescendo. I didn't have a good feeling about how the votes from Eliga would shake out in my gut. Ma'am. Cam flicked his ears in acknowledgement, as we fell in beside him and Chelm. The moment of truth. I've argued on behalf of your policies, even when I didn't agree with them. You couldn't have been more right about humans. I'm proud to have served your administration. Thank you, General, I whispered. Thank you for your service to our planet. Let's save the goodbyes or congratulations for after we hear the results, though. Copy that. An eerie silence overtook the lobby area, as dozens of staffers saw Jonek scan some new information off-screen. The Venlo journalist took a moment to prepare himself, savoring the suspense of the ultimate verdict. The knowing glint in his eyes confirmed that the results of the election were known, before he ever said a word. Eliga flashed orange to signify that it had been tallied on the visual aid map. All we needed was to hear the counts that would usher me into a second term or elect a new governor in my stead. It was all I could do not to bury my eyes in Noah's chest, and press my paws over my ears to avoid hearing. The impending news was almost too much to bear. Jonek cleared his throat. Eliga has submitted its votes, and with the last outstanding province in, Dayside News feed can now declare the new governor-elect. After winning the city's vote by a percentage of 54.6%, the 103rd governor of the Venlo homeworld will be. The journalist paused for dramatic effect, and my breath hitched in my throat. The election would be delivered with his next words, signaling what the voters had chosen for the future of Skalga. I hoped that, whatever decision they had reached, it would turn out well for both the Venlo people and our sincerest allies.